Inside Making a Murderer Season 2, where accusations and evidence are flying. Welcome to Haunted Road Media. I'm Mike Ricksecker. Well, it's been nearly 3 years since we first binge-watched Making a Murderer, and now Season 2 is finally out. Of course, it's really still incomplete as the legal battles still rage on, but this season was chock full of all kinds of information. The 1,200-page motion that Kathleen Zellner had filed with all the affidavits from all the technical experts. Yeah, we got an inside glimpse of all of that information that hadn't been previously released, and some things that you really had to dig for before that you didn't really notice before that are revealed here. Very, very interesting. So let's dive into what actually happened throughout this season. So episode 1 picks up really right where the last season of Making a Murderer starts. Brendan Dassey and Stephen Avery are still incarcerated and still fighting their respective legal battles. While we've met them before, we get a lot more this time around from Laura Norider and Stephen Dreisen on Brendan Dassey's side. And then on Stephen Avery's side, we get introduced, of course, to Kathleen Zellner, his new legal counsel. The series also does a nice job of incorporating a little Teresa Halbach memorial segment. What I really liked about this series is you got an inside glimpse as to what Kathleen Zellner's been up to. Sure, if you've been paying attention over the last couple of years, you've been able to read the news articles, you can read the motion that was filed of all the different tests that were conducted and what she's been up to, all the different tweets. But here you actually get that inside glimpse. You actually get to see the tests. You actually get to hear a lot more detail about what was going on behind all of these different tests and her perspective of what's going on in the Stephen Avery case, and even her perspective on what's going on with the Brendan Dassey case. So I took a ton of notes, of course, as I went through this, just because there was so much material that was covered. So when Kathleen Zellner took on the case, she dove headlong into proving Stephen Avery's innocence, and everybody was put back on the table. She examined all the possible players within it. She even bought the exact same RAV4 that Teresa Halbach had owned. And throughout the series, we get to see a lot of different tests and experiments that were operated on that car. So let's get into it. Stuart James, bloodstain analysis expert, spatter. So the big deal here was that Stephen Avery had had a nasty cut on his finger right before this happened. And from the bloodstains that were left in the car that were his, a lot of this was supposed that it was dripping off of his finger that he had injured. So what Stuart James said was that for the type of cut that Stephen Avery had, it was very unusual that no bloodstains were found on the key, on the steering wheel, on the door, on the gear shift. It doesn't make sense, of course, if there's an active source of bleeding. So they did all of these different tests on the car, and you actually get to see, okay, let's put some active blood on somebody's finger. Let's get in this RAV4, and they're testing out what happens. Now, they never actually got any blood on the location in which the police found blood in Teresa Halbach's car, but they got some on the gear shift, on the steering wheel. There's blood in different locations that just didn't match up with what was actually found in Teresa's RAV4. They also did a bunch of work on Teresa's blood that was in the car and the cast-off patterns that were not there, that should have been there, given the description of the way the state laid out the events of that day. So they did a lot of examining of the blood spatter on the rear cargo door, and of course that didn't match up. There are other scenarios in which it would have if somebody was bludgeoning her on the head and having a cast-off pattern that way straight to the back, but the state had said that this blood that was on the cargo door from putting her body in, and multiple times they attempted this, trying to recreate it with, again, the actual RAV4, and could not recreate it. The other thing that Stuart James pointed out was that you have two people bleeding here. You have Stephen Avery, who's supposed to be actively bleeding, and then you have Teresa Halbach, who, she's been murdered, blood all over the place. There should be a mixture of blood within the RAV4, and there was just no mixture of blood that was found within the RAV4. They're very separate. Stephen Avery's blood was found up front. Teresa Halbach's blood was found in the back. No mixture whatsoever. And so this is the type of thing that we got throughout Making a Murderer. As we went episode to episode, we got more and more of this analysis from different experts. As, of course, they're also intermixing what's going on with the families at this time, both Brendan's family and Stephen's family, which really, of course, is all the same family, but you do get to see them separated as well. So Stephen's parents are getting a little bit older. Dolores is having a lot of health issues, and they worry a lot about Stephen not getting out before they pass away. Of course, Brendan was incarcerated as a teenager. Now he's encroaching on his 30s, and so his younger years are dwindling away. So a lot of the format of season 2 was some focus on Stephen Avery, some focus on Brendan Dassey, and then some focus on the families. I think they did a really good job of integrating all of that together. I also really liked in season 2 how they expanded the view of the entire area. In season 1, it was really hyper-focused, of course, on Stephen Avery's property, the salvage yard, and that area there. In season 2, they really expanded that, so not only was it the salvage yard, but the couple different quarries that are there, the couple of adjacent highways. They really expanded the entire area so you can get a bigger picture of what was going on, because there was a lot more going on other than just at the salvage yard. So something they didn't really get into in season 1, because some of this information they just didn't really know, the quarry. So they found pelvic bone at the one quarry. We knew this, but there were actually more bones that were found in those quarries. So there's 2 different quarries. There's Josh Verdon, his quarry, and then there's a quarry owned by the Manitowoc County. And so the pelvic bone was actually discovered on the property of the Manitowoc County. And there were actually a couple other sites of bones that were actually found further away still from the Avery salvage yard that were actually much closer to what they call Highway Q. And these were found by the different scent dogs that they were using. They were using scent dogs and they were using cadaver dogs. In fact, there was one location away from the Stephen Avery property, there closer by the quarries, down what they call Cuss Road, and they actually hit on a burial site with one of the cadaver dogs. So you have the scent dogs finding these different bones that are out there. The scent dogs were going off of the Avery property. They kept wanting to go down toward the quarries. And then you have this burial site that they hit on that, the police had cordoned off for a little while, but they eventually moved away from there, saying that they hadn't found anything. But Kathleen Zellner is putting out this theory that the RAV4 was hidden down in that area for a while, and some other locations as we get into this a little bit more, and then was taking up this conveyor road that went straight through there onto Avery salvage yard that Avery kind of had blocked off with some old cars, just shells of cars that could really easily be moved. And there's some old photographs and some eyewitnesses that are saying, well, those cars looked kind of moved on that day that Teresa had gone missing. And so she's saying, they would have taken the car up that conveyor road from where it had been back there in the woods, and then just easily dumped onto Avery salvage yard. It's really kind of the quickest route to get a car up into there. Now, during all this, Kathleen Zellner is continuing to bring in more and more experts, like a forensics fire expert that's taking a look at the size of fire that would need to be used to burn a body in the burn pit and have those type of remains that were discovered there. And basically, the fire that was created there in the burn pit was not possible. For the type of flames that Scott Toddick had described during the trial, they would have needed an enormous fire constantly being fueled. It just was not possible for the type of fire that was there that day. There would have been, a lot more ash. If they had used, more things like old tires, which are a couple in there, they would have needed a lot more old tires. The fuel source just wasn't there for this type of fire that was described. So they're saying that the fire pit could not have been the primary burn location, that it would have been something like a burn barrel that would have kept the radiant heat inside. And we kind of already knew that. But something that was brought up here in season 2 that I don't think we really realized before was that there were no photographs that were actually taken of the discovery of the bones. Sure, we saw all kinds of photographs of the burn pit, but they didn't actually show any photographs of the bones themselves being discovered. There was also some, oddities about the searching of burn barrel number 2, which is where they actually discovered the bones, in that it had actually already been previously searched days beforehand. And then for some reason, they decided to go back through it again, and then boom, there's suddenly bones there in the burn barrel. There was also a burn barrel at the deer camp, which was near the quarry. So it's off the Avery property. It's within the quarry area of Josh Rendon. And what was kind of interesting about season 2 is we actually got a tour of that area from Josh Rendon. And it's different looking than it had been back then. So there's some trees that have grown up. I mean, we're talking, 15 years. There's some trees that have grown up. Some of the berms have been elevated a little bit. And some other access roads are either no longer there or have been blocked off. But it was actually nice to get that kind of a little tour of an area where these dogs were searching at. Now, Josh Rendon had reported that at that time that Teresa Halbach had gone missing, he did see a bit of a fire coming from the Avery property. However, he couldn't really make out any details. He couldn't tell if it was from a fire pit, a burn barrel, what have you. He could just tell that there was a fire going on over there. Now, he claims that the police did try to get him to say a little bit more than what he had actually seen, and he didn't go for that. And apparently, he was also told during that time by one of the investigators that a car was discovered down Cuss Road. Now, remember, Cuss Road is where the dogs hit on that burial site. Now, this is one of those things that Kathleen Zellner is hitting on as far as a Brady violation. Things that should have been disclosed to the defense during Stephen Avery's original trial that just weren't. And there's a number of these different cases that come up of where this disclosure was not given. And this is important because Stephen was convicted on the fact that Teresa Halbach's car did not leave the property. But if she had left the property and the car was discovered down this road, then, well, that would be Teresa's car leaving the property. And back inside that car, they were doing more testing with blood and the quote-unquote blood flakes that were found there on the floor. So, and then you have Stuart James in there, the blood spatter expert, that's telling us that, blood is just not going to flake like that on the carpet. And so, of course, they're busting out pieces of carpet that would have been from the RAV4 since they got, the exact same car that Teresa had. And they're doing these tests of, dropping blood onto it and showing how it's just getting soaked into the carpet. It's not sitting there on top and then drying up and becoming a flake. It's not working. However, what they did show was how you could actually put flakes on there. And so what they did to talk about the blood flakes and possible ways of getting Stephen Avery's blood, because Stephen maintains that they must have gotten into his house after he cut himself. His whole claim was that he had cut himself, he was dripping all of this blood into the sink. It was a pretty large gash if you see the photos, very large gash. Then he went out that night. When he came back, and I know this is a little disgusting, instead of going into the bathroom, he peed outside, came in, went straight to bed, did not wash up. And then it was the next morning in which he went to go take a shower. Now he wants to get clean. And the blood was miraculously just gone. So he maintains that's how he got his blood. Kathleen Zellner says, she inherited this whole vial theory, but she didn't want to go down that road. So she's exploring Stephen Avery's story on this. And that was his story. So they ripped out his sink from his trailer, brought it there. And so they're running all these different tests as to how somebody can get into Stephen Avery's trailer and steal his blood. Now, of course, my question on that is, how did they know his blood would have been there? Or were they just going into his house to try to get something on him, some sort of DNA, and just lo and behold, oh, jackpot, we got blood? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of speculation there. But in any case, there's proof of pry marks that are on the door. Can't really say for certainty that it happened that particular night, but there are pry marks on the door. And somebody could very easily take a nail remover or a pry bar, pop that right open. That proof is there. But they have his sink, and they're running all these different tests of, dropping blood into there and watching the way it runs down and pools, how the, drops on the top would flake. So if he'd already been out of the house for a little while, they go in, they take some of the little droppers, because supposedly it's these, technicians that went in there and got this stuff. They take the droppers, they're able to pull up the blood, not a problem. The stuff that's already dried a little bit, it's flaky, you scrape it off, it turns into flakes, and that's where they're supposing the flakes came from, is, from scraping it off of the side there and putting it on the floor. Physically, it can't flake there on the rug. So the flakes weren't created that way. They came from somewhere else. the whole idea of it coming from the sink, I think that's a lot of speculation, but it works if that's what really happened. Now, this is about the point in the series. We're about halfway through, and they're doing all these different tests, and there's a lot of things going on with Brendan Dassey that I haven't talked about yet. I'll get to here in a little bit. But this is about the point in the series where they start pointing the fingers at Ryan Hillegas. And, again, they're going more toward, okay, if you're starting to look at all these different people and you're starting to eliminate, based on, motive, opportunity, things like that, and they're narrowing it down. And so they're putting the focus, of course, back on Ryan Hillegas, the ex-boyfriend, who to me is really the only person in all of this with any real motive. And there's some newer information that's being thrown out there about him that they didn't cover in the first Making a Murderer. For one, I guess Teresa was just so fed up with him that she had an opportunity for a gig. She was a photographer at a wedding in which he was the best man at, and she did not actually want to take that job at that wedding. So there were some different emails and messages about how, he kept coming over and she didn't want him to come over. So she was just done with him. But yet, he's so involved with her investigation, he actually moved into her residence where she had been living at. So, what's going on with that? And then he had this elaborate story about her parking light. The parking light on the RAV4 was damaged. It had been broken off of the front of the car and had actually been tucked away into the back in the cargo area. And he had this elaborate story about how she had filed this insurance claim and all this to take care of the parking light. Well, a follow-up on that insurance claim, and there was no insurance claim that had actually been filed. And they put the posters out for Teresa Halbach being missing, and they're showing photos of the RAV4. No mention was ever made of the RAV4 actually being damaged. It's kind of one of those eyesores. You would notice the parking light being out, being totally removed off of the front of the car. It's one of those eyesores to help you point out, because sure, there's more than one RAV4 driving around. They say, oh, hey, it's that one. That's the one that's, missing the parking light. But no mention was ever made of that. So you got Ryan Hillegas in the middle of the suspicious stuff. And something that's making me take a real closer look at Ryan Hillegas, because I had, as far as my own theories, had pretty much ruled him out just because I couldn't place him there at the scene. It's like, yeah, he had all the motive. There was all that suspicious stuff that you saw going on in season 1, but I couldn't place him at the scene and all the stuff that I had seen on season 1 and all the stuff that I had read in the follow-up, because I've been keeping a close tab on this for years, reading all the articles, all the information that's been coming out. And there's a piece of information that was in season 2 that I didn't know before. And that was with the day planner. So Ryan Hillegas had Teresa Halbach's day planner, and it had a number of different notations in that day planner that were made while Teresa Halbach was on the road that day, that October 31st. And she's getting calls and setting up appointments and writing them in there as she's driving around to her different appointments. So it's something that was in the car there with her. And Kathleen Zellner does a wonderful job of mapping all this out, how she's going from place to place to place throughout her day, and showing where the calls were made. We have the phone records. You have people's testimony that are lining up, basically, verbatim. Call made at 11:35, and there's the record. Call, 11:35. The witness is saying 11:30, whatever. So all that's lining up. Remember, Ryan Hillegas moved into Teresa Halbach's residence for some reason. He couldn't have gotten it from there, because given her day, there's no way that she could have gone all the way back home to just drop off the day planner and then head back out. It just wasn't physically possible to do that. So she still has the day planner with her throughout the day, and yet he has it. So that's a direct link of Ryan Hillegas to Teresa Halbach's RAV4 on the day of the murder. Now, where his movements were throughout that day, we really don't know. But if he had her day planner, that connects him with the car on that day. And so now I got to take a closer look at Ryan Hillegas. So then we continue on with more of the forensics that are involved in this case. It was like each episode kind of had a feature on a different type of forensics examination that was done throughout this case. And so they went into the whole latch theory and what was going on with Stephen Avery's DNA on the hood latch. Well, It's one where the amount of DNA that was found there was a lot more than what should have been. So you get different expert testimony in there about running different tests of people doing a similar act, and the amount of DNA that was found would be minuscule, and Stephen Avery's was way elevated for whatever reason. So they're trying to track down where this DNA would have come from. And there's 4 types of fluids that you can pick up on. And so they're trying to say it was sweat DNA. So the other 4 would have been saliva, semen, urine, blood. None of those 4 checked out. So where in the world did this come from? So they're trying to track down the path that the swab took. So where did this swab come from? They're talking about things being mismarked. They actually brought up Stephen Avery's examination from when he was first arrested. They took him to a hospital, and they're getting fluids from him, and they're taking swabs and whatnot. And so they're supposing there was this whole question about, these groin swabs, and that the investigator said, well, we don't actually need those now. And they said that, then they were thrown away by the nurse. But the nurse didn't actually record the swabs actually being thrown away. So the idea, of course, here is that they actually took those swabs and then marked them later elsewhere in the investigation. And so in this theory, it's not that there was an actual swab taken of it, that there was something that was actually planted on the hood latch and the swab was taken. It's that there was another swab that was put in its place and just marked, hey, this came from the hood latch, and because of where it came from, it was just loaded with DNA because it came straight off of them in a place where guys kind of sweat a lot. So there's chain of custody questions that are brought up here throughout the series with Investigator Uyghur. That's right in the middle of all these different chain of custody questions. Then there's the bullet from the garage that everybody likes to say, well, Teresa's DNA was on the bullet in the garage. She must have been shot in the garage. And of course, one of the things we've always talked about is that there was no blood discovered in the garage, no human blood. And people try to say, well, it was cleaned up. And it's like, have you seen this garage? They weren't cleaning it up. Same with inside. Of course, we've talked about many times before about inside Stephen Avery's trailer, that there's no way they would have been able to clean up the mess. But in any case, you got to work with what you have. And so they have this bullet fragment that they say has Teresa Halbach's DNA on it. So they went out to the garage and were shooting at it because they wanted to get a closer look at what was going on with that bullet fragment. And so they actually did have some evidence that was released to them, which is very interesting, that they did have some released to them. And one of them actually that they got to take a look at, not actually keep it, they got to take a look at with the state there, was the bullet. And what they found in the bullet was not human bone. So they got a ballistics expert in there to show them what would happen with a .22 bullet and how difficult it is for it to pass, through one side of the skull and out the other. Not impossible, but extremely, extremely difficult. And when that happens, how much of the bone actually gets embedded within the bullet, and even more so if it would go through 2 sides. So they're examining the bullet that was found there, that was supposedly the bullet that killed Teresa Halbach, and they're not finding any bone on it whatsoever. They're finding wood, and then they're finding also some kind of waxy substance that they're at first thinking, did that happen from when they were swabbing from the DNA tests, or what was going on with that? They're not sure what the little bit of waxy substance was, but they're not finding bone. They're finding wood. So they go out to the garage, and they're shooting through the garage. And remember, there was a little bit of red that was picked up on that bullet fragment as well. So the garage is red. It's painted red. The thing is at this location, at this yard, they're kind of way out there. There's all kinds of shooting going on this property. They're hunting, they're shooting. They're seeing a lot of things. What they're shooting are like gophers, or shooting at rabbits, or there's guns being fired around this place all the time. And you can actually see some of the old holes within the side of the building from when rounds had entered the garage from somebody firing a gun. And so they're believing that this fragment's actually from there, and that it came through the wood of the garage and ended up there on the floor. And so they did this testing, shooting at the garage, and sure enough, there's a bunch of wood, and there's a little bit of red on there from the paint. So they're basically matching up the bullet fragments. So then comes the question of, okay, how did Teresa Halbach's DNA get on it? Well, enter in again another chain of custody issue. Items from Teresa's house are being transported. They end up at the Avery house for a little while, and just basically in transit. It's like, okay, we're going from Teresa's to the Avery's, and then we're going to go check them in. Well, one of those items was chapstick. So that's a waxy substance. Their idea is that, well, the chapstick was used on this bullet fragment, to get that DNA on there. So now there were other accusations that were made, just wasn't at Ryan Hillegas. There were also allegations that were launched at Bobby Dassey and Scott Toddick. Now, something that was not ever used during the trial for the defense was Brian Dassey's testimony. Brian Dassey, older brother of Bobby, who's also older brother of Brendan, had actually written a statement that Bobby had told him that he had actually seen Teresa leave the property that day. Of course, this flies in the face of Bobby's testimony of saying that the last time he saw Teresa was walking toward Stephen's trailer. So Brian had a much different testimony. Then there's also the question of the contents of the computer, of Bobby's computer, in that there's a CD of information out there that actually had the contents of what was on that computer, which was thousands and thousands and thousands of images of pornography, hardcore porn, torture. There's basically like snuff film type stuff. So really some gruesome stuff that was on this computer. Of course, all the search terms were much in the same, with that same very heavy, hardcore, grotesque type of stuff in there. And so this was never released to the defense. And so this is where Kathleen Zellner is saying there's a massive Brady violation here, and that stuff was never disclosed to the defense. Of course, what would have happened if that would actually had been released and had been presented is it would have totally blown Bobby Dassey's credibility out of the water in court, and he would not have been seen as a credible witness with, it's basically his timeline that was used in court to establish where Teresa was on the property that day. Scott Toddick is thrown into the mix because he says that he saw, Bobby driving down the road toward his place to go hunting. Now, some of the questions that were thrown in there, and this is even going back to the first one, is that he's recognizing Bobby at going 55 plus miles an hour down the road as they're passing each other, maybe. But to know his intent to go hunting behind his property, I don't know. It was always those two that corroborated on a timeline that I never actually believed. Now, I had a whole different theory about the two of them. It's a little bit different than what presented here, because I always thought it was something that was accidental between the two and they were covering it up, which still may be the case. Now, the way it's presented here in season 2, they did a whole entire recreation of what may have happened that day, basically according to Stephen's story. Could it have been pulled off? Because Stephen basically says, he walked out there, they had that exchange of money. She handed him the magazine, the Auto Trader magazine, and he went back in. He was going to go talk to Bobby, who he had, just seen or knew he was there because his truck was there. Comes back out, and the truck is gone. Of course, and he sees Teresa driving up the road and about to make a left. And so they did all of this. They recreated the whole thing. And, actually even with Bobby going out and, chasing down Teresa. And it actually worked. They had an actor playing, Stephen, and somebody driving Teresa's RAV4, because remember, they have a RAV4. Of course, the piece that they're kind of adding in here is Bobby going and chasing after Teresa. One of the things about Teresa is where her cell phone last pinged. And they have a location around that Cuss Road area. Basically, she had an incoming call that she didn't take, and that's the location where it was last pinged that day. And it was right there around that Cuss Road area. So they've got this theory, worked up, if Bobby's involved, that he goes chasing after Teresa. She pulls over to the side of the road. He flags her down. She pulls over to the side of the road here in this Cuss Road. And, maybe he's looking for a hustle shot or something like that. So, They probably knew each other, had already known each other from all the work that she had already done there on the property. She was there quite a bit. I mean, with all the thousands of cars that they had there, and they'd be selling through Auto Trader and whatnot. So she was there a lot taking photos. So she probably at least knew of him. Now, when Kathleen Zellner threw out this information about Bobby and Scott, of course, that erupted into this whole massive dramatic blow up between Barbara, who's Brendan and Bobby's mother and Brian's mother, who's also married to Scott. So she was all pissed off at Kathleen Zellner, of course, because she's accusing her family, and is on the phone with Steven. Steven's kind of playing it cool. He's like, well, if that's where the evidence is going, we're still doing the investigation. And during this phone conversation, Scott actually gets on there, and he is blasting with F-bombs left and right at Steven, and how much he hates Steven, and how much Steven has ruined his life. And it's really kind of sad how all dramatic this played out. But we'd seen that from Scott before in the first one, where he has this moment where, he erupts a bit, and he's talking about how much, Steven got what he deserved. And throughout most of this series, remember, I had already had my reservations about Scott, and he's just, he's sitting there with Brenda throughout all the stuff with Brendan. And I was just like, man, this guy could just be straight up lying to the camera, just kind of playing it cool, just, the whole thing along. I mean, sure, he wants Brendan to get out. I don't think he ever wanted that to happen, especially since he was going to, marry his mom. So I think he truly wants Brendan to come back, but, there's always this, big chance that he had a part to play in all of this. Kind of some of the fallout from this are different things that Brenda had said in that conversation and actually posted on Facebook, stating that he had never seen Teresa walk back towards Stevens, which, if that's true, that means he committed perjury. So Bobby was once again interviewed by investigators, in which, the whole play, because they played the actual interview, and it's kind of like they're all sitting there kind of chummy, kind of like, okay, we need to kind of get through this because it's an official thing. And Bobby's just sitting there saying, yeah, everything I said was true. And investigators are like, yeah, we know, okay, we get it. But as a formality, they had to do it because of what Barb was saying through this call and on Facebook. One of the interesting bits of information that came out of this was really kind of almost like from this quote-unquote mystery witness from Michigan, somebody that had once lived in the area, that knew Scott Toddick, and he was driving through the area doing one of his truck routes, and he had actually seen the RAV4. This is around the time Teresa Halbach had gone missing. He had seen the RAV4 kind of ditched off on the side of the road. Noticed it there, pulls into the service station a little ways down the road, mini mart, all that sort of stuff. And on the door is the missing person notification of Teresa with the RAV4. It's like, oh, hey, that's the car that I just saw down the road. Inside that service station is the cop. So he tells the cop, hey, that RAV4 from that missing person, the poster that's on the side of the door, yeah, that's just right up the road here. So, he thought he'd done his civic duty. He's watching Making a Murderer, and he's seeing all this stuff go down with, Teresa, the RAV4, all this. He's like, hey, I remember that. And then he sees Andrew Colburn, and he's like, hey, that's the cop that I told about finding that RAV4, about seeing that off on the side of the road. Of course, Andrew Colburn is one of the ones heavily involved in Stephen Avery's first case, in which he was exonerated for that botched DNA job, and where DNA got him off because of the botched investigation with information that had also been withheld, and Andrew Colburn had withheld that information. Well, he was part of the big lawsuit that was going down, $36 million lawsuit that was launched against the sheriff's department. And here it is, Colburn's in the mix again, and this time it's all that big deal about, there's the call where Andrew Colburn had called in the RAV4, and he's talking about, Teresa and what she's driving. He's like, yeah, 99 Toyota, right? And It's the way the whole call went down was as if he was actually looking right at the car. You can just tell from the things he's saying, he's looking at it. And so it's one of those moments that kind of like really ties the whole thing together. It's like, wow, this guy sees the car on the side of the road, walks into the service station, tells the cop, Andrew Colburn, and Colburn goes right up to check out this RAV4 that's sitting there and places the call. It's like, boom, everything's just, there it is. There's pieces of the story falling into place. So one of those kind of like, interesting aha moments. So another bit of interesting information that I didn't realize about the first Making a Murderer. And I guess as you're being shown this investigation, there's some assumptions you just make along the way. One of them was, okay, you're seeing photographs of the burn pit, and so you're thinking, okay, they got photographs of the bones. Well, there were no actual photographs taken of the bone discovery. But not only that, when you're being told that there's an investigation going on where there's human remains involved, you assume the coroner's involved too. But that wasn't the case. So Barbara Kadich was the Manitowoc County coroner at the time, and she originally found out about this discovery of the bones and Teresa Halbach from the news. And so she thought that she was going to be, called in to go ahead and check this out. So she called Wiegert, and Wiegert said, oh, I guess we overlooked calling you, but you don't go to the scene. The scene's already closed for the night. So she goes in the next morning, kind of expecting that, okay, I'm going to get involved now with this case. And so she gets called into the sheriff's office. Like, okay, this is where it's going to happen. Sheriff tells her she's not to get involved at all. And not only that she wasn't to get involved at all, but that if she went out there to the scene, then she was going to be arrested. Now, the statutes there in Wisconsin are placed just so that if there's been a murder, if there's a body found or what have you, that the coroner becomes the top dog at the scene. Except that's not the way it was being played here at all. So at a place where there are human remains that are found, the coroner is not involved here at all. There's no forensics experts on site whatsoever. Now, the defense tried to bring this in during Stephen Avery's original trial. However, as she was brought up to the stand and Ken Kratz is staring her down, there's an objection made by the prosecution. And so the jury is actually asked to leave the room. And they don't actually get to hear any of the testimony that she would have brought. And the judge upholds this and says, you're trying to make a case that there was a bias by the Manitowoc County departments and their involvement in the case. You can't have the coroner suddenly, come up here on the stand when you're trying to say that there's already this bias involved. So they dismissed her from the case. She was not allowed to be able to be called up as a witness. Interesting thing about that is, even though, okay, there was this conflict of interest from the Manitowoc County departments, and yeah, they were all over this case. This is the one person that actually may have had an objective point of view. In fact, because of the fact she wasn't actually involved with the investigation, she wasn't going to testify about the investigation. She would have been up there to testify about how she was withheld from the investigation. She resigned from her position 6 months later because she didn't want to deal with that anymore. So there's so many things that went down here in season 2, and this is really just an overview of it. There was a lot going on with the different court cases, and they did a nice job of mapping out how the process actually works. Of course, they got into this heavily with Brendan as you worked through his case, and that was really a lot of his focal point within season 2. That while they're doing all of this testing and forensics work on Stephen's side, you didn't really have that with Brendan's. On Brendan's side, it was more of the litigation and how they were taking these cases to the different courts. Now, during this time, they did get Brendan Dassey's conviction overturned. Of course, the state of Wisconsin is appealing that, and they got the 7th Circuit Court to uphold that. The state of Wisconsin continues to appeal that, and they did an en banc with the 7th Circuit Court, which then overturned the overturning. And some of the different statements by some of the different judges involved in this were quite interesting. The one judge, Judge Wood, talking about how it made her skin crawl to watch the interrogation of Brendan Dassey. And so I thought that the series did a really good job of portraying the legal process and giving kind of equal time to both Stephen's side and Brendan's side. Because in the first series, it was really heavily Stephen throughout most of it, and you'd get some glimpses of what's going on with Brendan, and there were some features with Brendan throughout, but was really heavily on Stephen. I thought they did a nice job the second time around of kind of evening it out. So every episode had that mixture of what's going on between the two different cases and then what's going on with the family. So Judge Wood's final comment on that, and I'll just read straight out of my notes, is that Dassey will spend the rest of his life in prison because of the injustice his court has decided to leave unresolved. And one of the interesting things about this series is they actually get into American law that passed down from the 1990s. They're basically saying that Dassey is in this situation right now because of what happened during the Oklahoma City bombing and Timothy McVeigh, that there was legislation that was passed in order to expedite his trial and his execution, to get it done in a quick manner. And the way they did this is by making it tougher for appeal cases to go through and have things overturned, but not just for death penalty cases or terrorist cases, but for all cases is the way the wording came out. So ever since then, it's been much tougher for appeal cases to work out, and to try to take it into the federal system. The federal judges feel handicapped by this law that's been in place since the 1990s, which was basically put into place to expedite everything that happened with Timothy McVeigh. So there's actually some politics that have worked into here, and they established this early on within the season. So you see how it plays out as they're trying to work this process for Brendan, and for them to get that original habeas overturning was really, really a miracle. The odds on that are so slim, but they were actually able to get it done. And then they had it actually upheld originally by the Seventh Circuit Court, a panel of 3 judges. Two of the 3 said, we're going to go ahead and uphold this, which again is difficult in itself. Unfortunately, the en banc, which was 7 judges, basically overturned that, and then they worked it up to the Supreme Court, and that's basically where the series, the season left off, is at the Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court only hears like 1% of the cases that it is given, and so they never actually got it into the Supreme Court this past year. So because of season 2, have I changed my theories on it? I don't know. I'm thinking about it. I'm taking a closer look at Ryan Hillegas now. There's some additional things about Bobby and Scott that I'm also looking at, and the way Zellner has put it all together, as far as those 3, it seems like she has it that they're all involved, but in very different aspects. They even have with Ryan Hillegas this phone record where he's receiving all these different calls the one particular day, back to back to back to back, from no caller ID. And the phone company said, well, it's probably law enforcement, from what they were able to gather from the records. And so Kathleen Zellner has this, of course, this theory about how Hillegas was in touch with law enforcement as they're going about trying to, hide a body and all this stuff, and hide the car. Again, that's all speculation, but it does give you some things to wonder about, because again, I couldn't originally place Ryan Hillegas there, at the scene, which is why it's like, man, he's got all the motive. He's the one with all the motive, but I can't place him at the scene. That day planner is like, that pretty much puts him at the scene. So I have to take a closer look at him. And then I've always been suspect of Bobby and Scott. And even though that takes off Barb, I'm sorry, but they usually say those that are involved are the ones closest to family. And while Ryan would be the one close to Teresa, Bobby and Scott would be the ones that would kind of screwed over their family. So it unfortunately happens. So please go ahead, leave comments below. Let me know what you think. We always have a lot of great discussion down there. If you haven't yet, please go ahead and subscribe. Can't wait until season 3. I'm Mike Ricksecker. Till next time.